Hi, this is Medi Ivy Harrison. I am doing a general writing class, and this is the very first of those classes called How to Write a Scene. The reason that I am doing this first, even though it might seem like this is a fairly intense class, is that it's the thing that I tell people most often that needs to be fixed. We are used to, in casual conversation, telling a story in a compressed way, and we do other things in person to make the story interesting. We do motions, we do voices. Those aren't things that can translate to the page. And so I'm frequently telling people in the margins of a manuscript, this needs to be a scene. It's a 1 or 2 sentence thing, and I say it needs to be in scene, that's what I say. Other people say show, don't tell. That's what they're talking about. They're saying put it in scene with all the details of a scene, and I'll talk about all these details that you need to put into a scene. There are many of them, and one of the reasons that we tell or that we do these 2 sentences is that it's shorter. It's a shorter way to tell a story, but it is not the best way to get a reader invested in a story. They're going to feel the emotions more if you help them to be in the scene themselves. They're going to relate more to your character. It will feel more real to them. And weirdly, it will feel faster than you telling them something in 2 sentences, because it will feel like they are inside of it instead of being told what is happening. So they forget how much time is passing while you're telling all these details. It does take a while for this to become more for it to feel like this is natural. It will feel a little bit stilted at first. Just because it feels stilted to you, however, as a writer, does not mean it feels stilted to the reader. Don't make that mistake of thinking, oh, this doesn't feel easy to me, so it's gonna read terribly to the reader. That's not the way that it works. It just takes a while for it to feel more natural. Let me just say, I think it takes about 6 weeks for you writing scenes on a regular basis. If you write a scene a day for 6 weeks, it will start to feel really natural to you. And I'm going to teach you how to see scenes in books that you read, how to see them in movies. They're all over the place. You're just not noticing them. I didn't notice them when I first started out. So, all right, here we go. I'm going to get my presentation. There it is. Share. Okay, here we are. You can see how to write a scene. All right. I tell people this all the time. It's easiest for you to think of scenes if you imagine films or television shows, because scenes are very clear visually. If you are watching a show, I want you to start watching when a scene starts. There's an establishing shot outside. That means there's like a big picture of a building. Sometimes it's an aerial shot. Sometimes it's of a scenic thing where you see an ocean. Often it's a building. Sometimes it's the front of the building. Sometimes, as I said, it's the top of the building. Sometimes there will be a banner across the screen that tells you where you are. Now we are in CBI headquarters, Sacramento, California. I say that because I've been rewatching The Mentalist. So, or sometimes it will tell you what time, and when time, I mean not 12 o'clock today, although sometimes they do that. More often it's 10 years ago. Sometimes if a story is being told out of chronological sequence, and this happens on television a lot, in movies sometimes, but maybe not as often. If a scene that opens the show is something that happens further on in the story, and they do that because taking that very tense scene out of sequence gets you invested in the show really quickly. And then after the credits, they'll do a different scene and they'll say 10 years ago or last week or 10 hours ago or something at the bottom to alert you to what time it is. So those are 2 of the things that is important that establishing shot does. It tells you the time and the place. So you have to do that, and I'll get to that. After they do the shot outside, they do a shot inside. Often there's kind of a pan that shows you the entire room and everyone who's in it, or they will let people come in and out. Again, this is the beginning of the scene where you get to know who the characters are. Many of the characters are named. That is, you already know them if it's a television show, or if it's a film, then in dialogue, you will establish carefully early on who the characters' names are, who are important to the scene. Now, there are characters who will not be named because they are not particularly important. I don't know, a police officer who comes on the scene may not be named. He's just the police officer. It's important though for you to know who the characters are who are in the scene, and notice when you're watching film or television that the camera always follows somebody when they leave the room, and the camera always shows you when somebody comes into the room. That door is a focus, right? Because that helps you know who's coming in and out and who's going to be in the scene. You have to do that as a writer. You have to tell us who's coming in and out. You have to show them leaving. You have to show them entering. Another thing about the scene is you know what everyone looks like immediately. Even if they have to get their names out there in dialogue, the camera shows you immediately what they look like, and you can distinguish who the different characters are. Again, even if they don't have names, you can tell, oh, that person looks different than that person. You don't even think that because you automatically, your brain automatically says, oh, that person with the yellow blouse, or however you think of it. But as a holistic thing, you're going to have to copy that in some way in your writing so that you know that. Okay. The first thing that you have to do is become aware of scenes in other media. As I said, I think it's easier when you're watching film or television to see the scenes unfold. You can't miss it. You will also notice that film and television has very little transition between scene. Film and television is basically made up only of scene. There isn't that, I mean, the only transition that you will see is like 5 days later. But often they won't even do that. They'll just assume that you can figure out that this is the thing that happened next. When you first start writing, you often don't see scenes, and you don't realize how much of a book, even nonfiction, is made up of scenes. So this is something I tell people I work with on memoir all the time. Even though it's nonfiction, memoir should feel very much like fiction in the sense of it has scenes. It is mostly made up of scenes. And when I say mostly, I mean 90% of the word count is made up of scenes. Yes, after a scene is over, you can reflect on it in the present, in who you are now as the author, but that should not take up more than about 10% of your word count. And I keep telling people as I read scenes, resist the temptation while you're in the scene to tell the reader what it means or what you think of it now. It is very hard for people to learn not to do that. Stay in the scene, stay in the present version of yourself, by which I mean the version of yourself who is in the scene. Do not tell us information that that person, that version of you from some time ago knows. And by the same token, I think it is best to resist the temptation to tell the reader information about the scene, if you're writing fiction, that they will not know, like to warn them, oh, something's coming. I know some writers do it and it can be done, but I'm going to still suggest that you resist the temptation because it is very delicate, and too much of it, it just wrecks the scene. It wrecks the beauty of feeling like you are inside the scene, and there's a suspension of disbelief that makes the scene feel real. If you tell too much about what's going to happen next, you wreck that. So the natural tendency is to explain everything. That's how we talk in conversation. We don't necessarily try to do dialogue. Some people do, but even then it's fairly limited. You do just like a one back and forth. You don't do continuous dialogue. You don't set the whole scene. You don't say what color the walls were. You don't say what paintings were there or what somebody was wearing. You just don't do that in a regular conversation. That's why I'm saying you have to figure out how to do it, and it has to start feeling natural to you. When I was first starting out writing, this is like the first year that I was writing, I remember I was working on the science fiction novel, and I was working on the first few chapters, and I couldn't figure out how to stop the scene. So I would tell continuously everything that happened in this person's life, and then they went to the bathroom, and then they ate dinner, and then they went to bed. It's important for you to realize that you are only supposed to tell the scenes that are interesting and important to your story. And whenever there's a part of the story that is no longer of interest to the reader, you just stop the scene, and then you have a very brief transition that says the next day or 2 weeks later, or however long that is. You can have a full paragraph where you explain what happens between the end of the last scene and the beginning of the next scene. Like, in the meantime, the council decided XYZ, and 2 weeks later, and then go on to the next scene. Okay, so again, these are things that you're going to have to practice. They will feel mechanical to start with, but they will gradually feel like automatic. I do not think about scenes that much, but I tend to write in them. And I'm also going to admit here that even somebody who has been publishing for 20 years now, I remember I sent out a book that I've been working on that I'm really nervous about. It's a new thing. I sent it out to a friend who had offered to read the first chapter. And the first thing that she said was, this needs to be more in scene. So I think that part of that was my fear had taken over, and I wanted to like tell you everything about what was going on instead of showing what was going on. So I had to go back and think and look through the prose that I had written, which is exactly what I do as a critiquer of other people's fiction, look through it and see where the scenes can be and like circle them to myself and put in a little note to myself, okay, this is a scene, and then expand it out. And sometimes I ended up just cutting out sections where I was like, okay, I'm not going to tell that part. Or I move from scene to scene more quickly. You can have scenes that last only a paragraph. You can have scenes that last 2 or 3 paragraphs. You can have a scene that lasts 20 pages. If you ask me how many scenes make up a chapter, I'm going to tell you to go and look at some books that were published in the last year in the genre in which you're aiming to publish and start looking at them. I want you to take a pen or a highlighter or something and start marking the beginning and the end of every scene and look at how many scenes are in a chapter. And I'm going to admit that it's going to vary from author to author. Some authors have very short scenes. Some authors always do very long scenes. I think J.K. Rowling tends to have really long scenes and several scenes in each chapter, so her chapters are very long. Robert Parker, who does the Spencer books, does very short chapters, which usually consist of only one scene, and sometimes they're only 1.5 pages long or 2 pages long, and that's just the way that he writes his books. I think that it's very instructive to look at his books because his scenes are very meaty. They contain a lot of information, and he does it in a really short period of time. He's a master at that. And so I have spent a lot of time analyzing how he manages that. His characters are, however, the kinds of characters who don't talk a lot. So I don't know if it works if you have characters who are chatty, like Hermione Granger, I think is a sort of chatty character, and she's going to make scenes take longer. Okay, I think I've gone through this. All right, this is what I have to tell you as the writer. You have to do everything as the writer. It's one of the curses and blessings of being a writer that you have all of the control, but it also means you have to do all of the work. A film is a gigantic production with often hundreds of people who are working on it. I mean, I guess you could do a film with like 12 people, but that would be really difficult to manage. You are all of the people on the film. You're the director. You have to decide when the scene begins and ends. You are the set designer. You get to decide all of the things that are on stage in the scene. You write the dialogue. You are the casting director. That means you choose how all of your characters look. You're choosing what they are like. You're choosing the actors who play them. You're doing makeup for everybody. So you're going to describe exactly how that makeup looks. You choose all of the clothing that everyone wears. And you also decide the lighting, the time of year, the mood. That's something that sometimes we forget. A television series or a film will have music to indicate the mood to the listeners. Next time you watch something, notice how the music works to tell you what the mood is, to tell you what your emotional response is supposed to be. We don't have that in books. There's no soundtrack in your book. You are the soundtrack. You have to do that. And you have to figure out how you're going to do it. Are you going to do it by telling the reader how to feel, or are you going to do it by having the characters show their emotions? Are you going to do it by using certain kinds of words, kinds of sentences? Are you going to use it by long sentences? Are you going to use short clipped words, really short sentences? There's a variety of ways that you can do it, but you're doing all of that work. And sometimes that can feel really overwhelming. I'm just going to admit. So the first time you try to write a full scene, you may end up cutting it short. I want you to go back and look at it again and see the places where you could add more information in. Okay, there's more. I know, it's scary, isn't it? Okay, when a scene opens, it will take a paragraph or so to explain place and time for the opening of each scene. Usually you can simply refer to each character by one name, Tom or Jones, and it's confusing to refer to more than one name. So if they have a title or the police officer or something like that, you refer to that just once, and then after that you refer to their name. For instance, if you have a principal and his name is Mr. Anderson, okay, you will say Mr. Anderson, comma, the principal, comma, said, welcome to our meeting, right? After that, you refer to him only as Anderson. Don't go back and forth between referring to him as the principal or Anderson. Only use Anderson after that. It's just a matter of simplicity. It helps your reader get the information that they need quickly without confusion. You will find out in this course that clarity is a priority for me in writing. Clarity, clarity, clarity. All right, so then I say get to the character interaction as quickly as you can. The meat of your scene is conflict between your characters, or possibly conflict with their circumstance, which they are working on together. But if characters are working on something together, always remember there's still conflict between the characters because people are different. They see the world differently. They're going to see how to solve problems differently. They're going to have sharp edges that bump up against each other. Don't forget that. No matter how much your characters like each other, they're married in a way, right? You know how it is in a marriage, maybe, that like there's always something that bugs you about the other person and that you do that bugs them, and you are usually aware of that. If not, it will come up. Okay. Now I'm skipping over the center section of a scene. I will get to it in just a moment, but I'm trying to give you like the bookends of the scene. The first part I explained. Now, when a scene ends, the conflict has been resolved in some way, though it may come up again. So I'm going to talk about the conflict in just a minute, but I want you to remember that the conflict has to be resolved. So some of the things that I see frequently when I see people who are doing scenes is that they refer to the conflict, but they don't specifically display it on the page. I think that we have a tendency to do that because we're uncomfortable with conflict, or we're not sure. Sometimes there are problems because maybe the scene where the full conflict is displayed is a scene that your main character isn't a part of, and you're not sure how to get at that. And it is tricky because it can be a gimmick to have your character listening in at doors. I mean, I'm aware of my Linda Walheim character in my mystery series. She's an amateur detective, and she does listen in on doors and does overhear things, and she does snoop around and find stuff. But I have to be careful not to use the same gimmick over and over again, scene after scene. Like, she can't overhear every single scene. That's a little bit overkill. So you have to be clever in how you show how these scenes work. Now, in my Linda Walheim series, she is a first-person narrator, which means everything in the story has to be told from her point of view. And I will talk about point of view in a different lesson. But I can't give information. I can't show scenes that Linda is not privy to. Only the information that she knows is what ends up on the page. You don't have to choose a first-person narrator. And even if you do choose a first-person narrator, you can have two first-person narrators. You can have a first-person narrator and a third-person narrator who both tell parts of the story. However, you can't introduce another narrator midway through the book who only tells one scene because it's convenient for you. You have to choose at the beginning of the book who your point of view characters are and then carry them through the rest of the book. So you need to show conflict rising. You need to show the peak of the conflict, and at the end of the scene is when it has been resolved. You can't just end the scene without a resolution. You can, however, have someone storm off. You can have them agree to something that later they decide they're not going to follow through on. But there needs to be some sense of closure that the scene is over. All right, that's your job. The scene beginning, the scene ending. You have to do those two parts. And let me get to the middle. All right, here I'm going to talk about conflict in a scene. There is conflict in every scene. If there's not conflict in the scene, then will not be a scene that you choose to display because it will not be interesting. If they're just going to the bathroom, then no, there's no conflict in that scene. That is why you don't show them going to the bathroom. It is not interesting. The conflict doesn't have to be an argument between people, but it often is. It can also be a conflict with nature, or something where people work together against an obstacle to their goals. But remember, as I just said, this people are people, and there are always going to be tensions between them. Conflict rises, hits a peak, and is resolved. If you, I just did a visual representation of that. It's a microcosm of the rising conflict of a book. If you've ever taken a class where people talk about rising tension in a book, right? Starts out with low tension, then rises to the climax, and then there's the denouement. Well, that same pattern is in every scene. That is how people get interested in a book. That's how you pique a reader's interest. That's how you lead them through a scene. It's how you show characters. It's how you show them interact. It's also how you show them grow and learn. And even when you have like a try-fail cycle, which we'll get to in plotting, they try something, they get excited that they're going to succeed, and then they don't succeed. That's that rising conflict you will see everywhere. All right. This is something I'll talk about a little bit more when I get into dialogue, but characters often don't say what they want. This is how you get at conflict. Like the conflict with your characters is that this character wants one thing and this character wants another thing. However, they don't just always say to each other, I want this. I want a chocolate sundae, or I want to go to Taco Bell. All right. That's the conflict between the two characters, but they don't always say that, which is very frustrating. I know in particular men complain about women, that women don't just say stuff. They say what they want often because women are socialized not to say what they want. But it's not just women. Many people have different ways of interacting in the world and expressing their wants and desires. And so you have to figure out what feels real for each of your characters. Now, if you have two male characters who have no reason not to say what they want, maybe they will just say what they want and they'll just argue over it openly. But if not, then you may have one character who says, I want this, and the other character is just going to talk around what they want and just say, well, what about this? Or I have a friend who likes this. So they don't always say what they want directly. And now a second problem is that they don't always know what they want. Or they sometimes want something, but it isn't what they need. It would be terrible for them to get that thing. You as the writer have to know each character intimately, know what they want and know what they need, and then you have to display it in your scenes so that your reader can figure it out. But you don't tell your reader exactly what each character is like, because that is boring and it feels like you're lecturing. And people don't read fiction for a lecture. They read fiction to discover things. They want to come to their own conclusions, even though you're leading them to that conclusion. And this is true in scenes. All right, scene transitions. I've talked just briefly about this. I again suggest that you start noticing these in films and books. Usually they are a sentence or less. It can be as simple as the next day, but it can be more complicated. Now, this is something that I'm gonna just talk briefly about. If you have a strong authorial voice, you can process the scene for the reader, but it's very 18th/19th century. Most modern writers let the reader process on their own. So if you go back and read Jane Austen, for instance, she's mid-19th century, 1820s and 30s. She has a really strong authorial voice. She also tends to use an omniscient point of view, meaning she can tell you what anybody is thinking at any time, and she does. That is not the way that people write today most of the time. I did notice as I was reading Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere that she uses a kind of omniscient voice, but it's a very modern one. She doesn't hop from head to head frequently, and she carefully marks when she's moving from Mia's head to Pearl's head, but she does do it in the middle of a scene, and that is not typical for modern writing. Most of the time, people recommend that you stay in one person's head for the entire scene, and if you're going to change heads, that you wait until the end of the scene to change heads, and then you can tell us what that character thought about the scene previously when you're in their head for the next scene, if that makes any sense. If you're switching heads, you do need to clearly mark it. As I said, I don't recommend using an omniscient point of view, and it can feel heavy-handed to tell the readers too much about what you think they should take from the scene. So in general, I would recommend a light hand with that. All right, some scenes are very short. I've talked about this. Some writers always write very short or very long scenes. Most writers, however, switch back and forth between long and short scenes. When I am working with people, I do sometimes say, hey, I think this should be a scene, right? But I am wary to tell them exactly how long the scene should be, exactly what information needs to be in the scene, because those are your choices and that is your voice as an author. That's how you make choices that let your voice come through. It's not just the words, it's also some of the mechanics of how the book works scene by scene. And it is useful to start thinking of your book as a skeleton of scenes that fit together. And you can move the scenes around. If you use a program like Scrivener or YWriter, which is the free version online, helps you to see that there's a bar on the left in YWriter, which is the one that I have used the most, that just has the scenes listed. And you can move them around super easily. A lot more easily than you can if you're just using Word. But it's useful for you to start thinking of your book as a series of scenes that can be moved and that you can add scenes in or you can take them out. That doesn't, sometimes we write scenes and we take them out of the book, and not because they were useless, but because there are things that we needed to know about the characters, but the reader does not necessarily need to know that information right now. The reader just needs to know the information we decide to give them. All right, I've said this before, you only tell the scenes that are important. Don't tell the scenes that are uninteresting. Just skip over them. You write them for yourself, but not necessarily for the reader. Show, don't tell. That means they tell it in scene. Scenes are the way to engage your reader and make them feel that they're part of the story, that it's happening right in front of them. It's the way that you make them feel like these are their family members. These are their friends. These are people, like it's right in your house. It's in your brain. All right, and then this is something that I remember learning from David Farland, AKA Dave Wolverton, my really early years before I think I was published. He taught a class and we all sat in this big room in a hotel in American Fork. And he talked to us about why people read. And he made a very persuasive argument that people read not because they want to learn about something, but because they want to experience it. It's our way of experiencing things that we can't experience in our own life because we are not everybody. We are only one person. And also we have limited people around us that we already know. And most people don't spend their entire lives hopping from location to location just so that they can have interesting experiences. Most of us have to have a job, and the job's going to be the same most days. It can be tedious. The people in our lives are mostly going to be the same. But reading is a way to experience things that are not part of your regular life. And you want to have a full immersive experience, including the emotion. Even in nonfiction, readers often want to feel what it's like to be in a situation rather than being told information. Or in nonfiction, they want both. But I want you to remember that it's easier for a reader to remember a scene they experienced with all of their senses than it is to remember a list of information. I guarantee that your favorite nonfiction books, when you talk to other people about them, you remember scenes. For instance, I read a book a few months ago called Factfulness by Hans Rosling, and he has a lot of lists. It's a great nonfiction book. But what I remember when I tell people about reading that book is the specific scene where he talks about a medical intern who's running for an elevator in Africa. And the doors start to close in this elevator, and the student sticks out their arm to stop the elevator doors from closing. Now, if you're from the United States or from Europe, if you stick your hand in a door, what you expect, an elevator door, is for the door to reopen. In Africa, apparently, when Hans Rosling was there with his medical interns, that was not what happened. The door continued to close on that person's arm, and then the elevator started to go up with that person's arm in it. And Hans Rosling, as he watched this happen, he ran and he got the student out. But one of his African friends, doctors who was consulting with him, said, "You should not work with that intern. That was a really stupid thing to do, to stick their arm in that door." And Hans Rosling tried to explain that in Europe, that would be a normal thing to do. But in Africa, it was not a normal thing to do. It was a stupid thing to do. And the point of this story was that he was saying that what people do makes sense in their context. And it's really easy for us to make judgments about other people doing what makes sense to them if we're looking at it from our point of view. And it was, as I said, it's the story that I tell most often when I talk about that book, that I feel like one of the things that he taught me was what's normal and natural and makes sense for someone else in a different situation isn't the same thing that makes sense for me. And that it's useful to, when I think about other people, to try to see what they're doing as something that makes sense to them. If I can figure out what situations they've been in, instead of assuming they're stupid. That's the point, that people aren't stupid. People are doing things that are adaptive to their situation. But it's the scene of that elevator door closing, that moment, that I remember, that I tell, not the list of things. I think he has a list of 12 important lessons for people to learn, and I don't remember which number that was or what the other ones are, but I remember that scene. So even when you're writing nonfiction, scenes are important so that people relate to it. As I say, I remember that scene. It's the scene that makes me think the most about, that lesson that I learned from that book, because I felt like I was in the scene. It made sense to me. All right, one other piece of advice that I have about scenes is to engage all of the senses in a scene. Now, you may not do this on your first draft, but when you go back, think about how you can add all 5 senses, touch, smell, sight, hearing, and taste, into each scene. Now, don't put them all at the beginning, but just have one of those senses. Some people are more sensitive to one of the senses. Some people are not sensitive to a particular sense. So you want to add all of them in. Again, this is to get your reader an immersive experience so that it feels to them like they are in that scene. I said this before, not all the characters have to be named. You can sometimes just refer to them as the policeman or the principal. Scenes can be wordless. You can have an entirely action-based scene without any dialogue. So when I say wordless, I don't mean like no words on the page. I mean without any dialogue. And that can tell the reader a lot about a character without them saying anything. I suggest mixing up action scenes and dialogue-heavy scenes with your books. All right, just briefly, I'm going to touch on flashbacks here. Flashbacks need to be clearly marked as flashbacks. If you use them, you need to use had. I had an idea, pluperfect tense. Tell us how long ago it was, generally about 10 years ago, I had an idea. Make sure you clearly mark the time frame in the sentence leading into the flashback and then the sentence leading out of it. And then my only other tip here is beware of using flashbacks in the first chapter. It's hard for readers to get into a book. So make your first chapter, which already has to have a lot of information in it, make it as easy as possible for the reader to parse so they're not tempted to close the book because it's too hard to figure out. Add harder stuff later on in the story to make your first chapter as gripping as possible with like one scene, no flashbacks. Just general advice. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. I hope that it's been helpful. I'm really trying to get you to analyze scenes, to see things more mechanically. Now, there are going to be many drafts of your book as you're working on it. Some of those drafts will be mechanical, where you're thinking very carefully about big picture kind of stuff, scene by scene. Other drafts, you're going to look at it sentence by sentence. It's hard sometimes to switch back and forth from big picture to small picture. So that's why sometimes I recommend to people, just on this draft, only look at big picture issues. Then on this draft, only look at sentence by sentence stuff. On this draft, look only at characters. On this draft, only look at whether or not the conflicts are rising in each scene. Okay, so books are very complicated. It can be, I'm just going to say it's impossible to wrap your mind around all of the parts of a book all at the same time. So that's why I suggest that you're going to be going through different drafts and trying to work in different parts of a book. It is very hard to think about the whole entirety of a book all at the same time. So this is a way for you to think about just the scenes. And as I said, I want you to start noticing them in film and television first, then open up a book that's been published in the last year in the genre that you're trying to publish in, and look at how the scenes come out. Don't make the mistake of falling back into a book if it's one that you love. Try to keep yourself in that mechanical, big picture thing, so you can just look at the scenes, mark them, mark where they start, look at how long they are, look at which ones are dialogue heavy, which ones are action heavy, see how many of each they have. It's really useful to start looking at things in this mechanical, analytical way. It'll help you to become a better writer. So good luck.